So if you're running into extra clicks and pops in your trigger pull, or if you have a completely dead trigger, or your trigger is not resetting, or if your firearm is not going completely into battery, either you have to hit it into battery or it's just stuck, or if you're having malfunctions where the round is nose down or nose up into your barrel and everything's just sticking in there and you just want your firearm to fire reliably, then watch this video, because we're going to go through possibly all of the malfunction fixes for this and these issues. Welcome to my Glock clone malfunctions journey. And I think that really encompasses what was happening with these Glock clones that I bought and put together. You buy the frame, and just before we get started, there is nothing in the chamber. These firearms are completely clear, 100%. There is nothing in these firearms. They are completely clear, no live ammunition on the table or anywhere nearby. So yeah, you buy a frame and you say to yourself, well, that's a killer frame. I've got kind of these smaller mitts than most, and so you want the 19 or the 27 type of shorter grip, but you want to keep the length of the barrel, so you get the 22 frame so you can put on that longer barrel and longer slide. And maybe not. Maybe you went with the Glock 19 clone, or maybe you went with the Glock 17 clone, or maybe you went with the 22 clone with the longer grip there. In any rate, you came to this video for a reason. You're having some malfunctions and some issues with your firearm, and we're going to talk about probably every single one of them and diagnose just what's going on with your firearm, so you don't have to go through what I went through with this. Okay, let's take it down. So again, there is no live ammunition. All right, so you got your frame, and you may have all Glock internals. You may have bought internals from eBay, which I do not suggest. I've done that and they are terrible. You may get a couple of good range days out of them, and then they just are junk. You'll start to run into all kinds of malfunctions. And so the first thing I suggest is get either Glock OEM internals for your firearm portion of your gun. Get OEM, or you can go with the tried and true aftermarket stuff but even with that, you may run into a lot of issues. And so I think the first thing to address is get all OEM stuff and then start tinkering around with it. If your first go at a Glock is a clone and you think you're gonna build it from the ground up, you're gonna run into all kinds of mess, because that's what happened to me. And so if you'll see here, I've got the OEM trigger housing. And so I've got the OEM ejector and the trigger housing here. But then I went with the Timney trigger because I wanted something nice. I wanted that nice crisp break. I didn't want a bunch of travel time. I wanted to be able to have a decent firearm for the money. And so you think to yourself, yeah, Glock, trusted, tried and true. Let's get something that is exactly like it, but a little bit better. And so you go with aftermarket parts because you're like, man, this is supposed to be better than the OEM stuff. And so I have that Timney trigger in here. We can take a closer look at that real quick. I'm gonna put this slide back on. Again, firearm is clear. So here's that break in take up. Barely any take up. Nice crisp break. And there's no back travel time, and we'll get to that. There's no slop. There's no backward motion after you pull the trigger. And then up. There it is. It barely moves. Nice crisp break right there. So it barely moves at all. That's what I wanted. That's what I wanted. It took a while to get there. So the first part of that was the travel time, initial travel time. And if you'll see, I'm pushing, it's not going anywhere until I push on this red stopper here, this safety, and now it'll move. But it only moves to right there. It doesn't go any further from here to there. And that's as far as it goes. Just that is the only travel time it has back and forth. It doesn't go any further back when you rack the slide. As you see there, little take up, nice crisp. And how I got there with this part to where it doesn't move is you take your tool, and the Timney triggers are great with that. As far as travel time, initial travel time, you can really dial that in with the Timney trigger. And then as far as the after pull slop, that's something different. So what I used for that is this Ghost connector. It's called Ghost, and I think this is the Evo. And so this connector, this is a different one. This is not the one I'm using, obviously. And this one I shaved off a little too much. And so there is some back travel on that. So I got another one and made it perfect. And so where it breaks nice and crisp and there's no travel time. And so you just get that crisp pull every single pull. And I think this is a 3.5 pound tuned connector there. And so these are fantastic. That's what you're going to want. So if you're looking at a new trigger and you're having issues with your firearm, and we'll get to all the issues here in a moment, but if you want that nice clean break in your trigger, get yourself a Ghost here, and you'll have to do some work on that, obviously. And there's tons of videos out there that you'll see exactly what I'm talking about with that. And then you want that crisp break, get a Timney. Okay. And the reason I mentioned all of that, I know this is supposed to be about malfunctions. The reason I mentioned all of that is because you will need to both shave this down and bend it. Well, at least that's what I had to do. Now the bend on this, at least for me, had to be a perfect angle. It couldn't be just a little bit, not even a millimeter in the wrong direction. And I don't know if that's because this is thicker or it's made out of a different metal. Yeah, but I had the same issue with a connector that I bought off an eBay from a kit, an internals kit, and it was really causing a lot of problems. So it caused a flat trigger or a dead trigger, and there was no reset. Sometimes it wouldn't break. There was no break. No matter how many times I racked it, there was zero break. It was just a dead sloppy trigger. Other times it would break, and that was great, and then it would not reset. And so if you're anything like me and you hold the trigger, it slides after your round, and then you wait for that wall, and you're waiting for that reset, and there's no reset. And so you want that wall, and then you want to pull the trigger again. You don't want to, have your finger going just full bore, blah, 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 blah. You're waiting for that wall. You're slowly backing off the trigger, you hear a click, and then you pull the trigger. And you're going to be more accurate that way, at least I am. And so that's what I was waiting for, and it wasn't there. So with the connector is going to play almost 100% part in that. If you have a dead trigger or it's not resetting, it is the connector. And you may have tried it. You may have heard this before, and you're like, okay, I'm gonna bend it, and I'm gonna bend it this way or that way, and you may be wondering to yourself as well, is it supposed to push past that barrier? And it is. There's a part in the slide that pushes past the barrier that the connector has, where the slide will actually move it out of the way, and then your trigger bar will go past, and that's what it's supposed to do. All right, pulling the trigger, and as you'll see back here, when you pull the trigger, this connector here, that is the connector. The connector here, the slide will slide past this and bump this out of the way. And so you'll feel kind of something happen like this. And if you look in there, yeah, it went past. It went past the trigger bar, went past the connector here. And then when you let go, that's the reset. And so that is supposed to happen. Another thing I was encountering was I would get 3 or 4 clicks when I pulled the trigger, and I thought to myself, what is happening here? The first click was a rub of the trigger bar, the little fin there, against the safety plunger, and the safety plunger was, again, that eBay kit, and then I got a smoothed or a rounded out titanium one from Glock, and it did the same thing. Except for this time it wouldn't give a click. It was just kind of grindy and crunchy. It just didn't feel good. And so there was material that was taken off of the plunger, and it's as smooth as butter now. The other click I was getting was the actual trigger pull, the click of the fire pin engaging. And the third click for me was that trigger bar moving past the connector portion, and it was doing it really hard because my connector was bent so far out that it was causing that to make an audible click as it went past it. And the fourth click then was that trigger bar sliding off the connector. And so to fix that first click, material had to come off that plunger. Not a ridiculous amount, not even a millimeter, not even close to a millimeter. It just needed to be buffed up a little bit. To fix that second click, again, I got that Timney trigger and that ghost connector. And so now the second click is nice and crisp and as it should be. To fix the third and fourth click, it's that ghost connector. That's the one that I use. It doesn't have to be a ghost connector. It can be something else if you don't mind the slop at the end of your trigger pull, which is 100% fine. OEM Glock triggers are just like that. But that third and fourth click, the bend in that connector needed to be perfect for me. And here's what I mean. Let me just take out that retaining pin there. And here it is. So this is the connector. And again, you'll see here with this other ghost connector, this part right here, this is the part that interfaces with the cruciform portion of your trigger. This is taken down a little too much. And again, that just causes slop. It's still a great connector. It's still, in my opinion, better than the OEM connector, but it has that slop at the end of the trigger pull. This one has much more material on the end here. And so that cruciform, and this is a Timney, so it doesn't have the cruciform, it just has this bar. That bar will then run into that connector. And so it makes it so when you pull the trigger, it'll click, and then there's not all of that take up. And so it'll stop right there. And I know people who have put like BBs or plastic inside this portion here, right there in between the trigger bar and the frame. I do not suggest doing that. There's options. You don't have to like Frankenstein it. If you put a BB in there, you may run into catastrophic failure. So don't do that. Please don't do that. I know there's a video out there suggesting to do that. I do not suggest doing that. And so that will solve the issue there. As far as those clicks and trigger slop and all of that, here's the bend. The bend I was talking about right here. And this, if you can tell, is lined nice and flat up with this. There's no space to go in between. You can't feel a bump here. It's just completely flat. And so you'll see them where, and I'm just going to kind of pull it out a little bit. I'm not going to bend it the other way or this way. People will tell you to do that. They'll say, hey, yeah, bend it this way if it's causing you issues, or bend it that way if it's causing you issues. And if it's bent out this way, you'll see that there'll be a gap right there up at the top. And that's going to cause some clicks and some stress and some pressure on your firearm. You don't want that. And if you bend it too far in this way, you will have a completely dead trigger. That's why your trigger is dead, is because it's way too far in that way. And so what you want it to be completely flush. Completely flush. Okay, so that takes care of the clicks and pops. Okay, so what if your firearm, you fire it, and it doesn't go all the way back into battery, and it kind of looks like this, or maybe that's too over dramatic. Maybe it looks something like this, and you just can't get it back into battery. It's just stuck right there, or you have to rack it and then a round goes flying out, or after you shoot it, there's no round in the chamber, but it's still stuck in out of battery like that. What's going on there? So I was told to get a 20-pound spring for that it's not going back and fully into battery. You're using a 40 Smith & Wesson round, and so it has a higher pressure so it can take the spring without causing short stroking issues to where it would pick up the round about halfway through or right at the indent in the back. And so that it gets gross when it short strokes, because the 20-pound spring, as far as the guide rod spring, is going to be heavier, and so it doesn't go all the way back and then pick up the round from behind. People are like, yeah, you're using a higher chambered round, and so it's going to have higher pressure, and so the 20-pound spring won't do that. And from what I've noticed, that's accurate. And for a little while, it was shoving the slide and the round into the barrel and the slide into battery, and everything was chambering just fine. But after a while, I noticed that that didn't matter anymore. It was the slide was still doing this, and it would catch up there, and it was, at times I would really rack that thing, and then I could pull it back and send it flying, and it just wouldn't go back into battery. And so something else was going on, something else was happening there. And so what was it? Well, this is what happened with me. I actually went out and bought a Gen 3, because these clones are usually duplicated after the Gen 3. The internals that you use for these are usually Gen 3, beside the trigger housing in this. This is Gen 4 for the trigger housing and the slide release. But usually they're all the internals are Gen 3. And so I went and got a Glock 22 Gen 3. As you'll see here, I did put a different barrel for that 40 Smith & Wesson round. That's where it really shines, is when it has a longer barrel. But this barrel I had on this clone, and it is a Lone Wolf barrel, and this is a Lone Wolf lower. This is not a Lone Wolf slide. And so it ran into a bunch of issues in here. Now I have the Glock OEM barrel in there, and a polymer guide rod. It's the Gen 3 internals now, as far as the barrel, the guide rod, and the guide rod spring. And so now this thing races. This thing runs like a champ. Zero malfunctions. And we'll get to the nose up and nose down malfunctions as far as the rounds sticking in the chamber is concerned. But as far as, am I going to need a different guide rod spring, because it's just not going into chamber? You may need, to be 100% with you, you may need a different barrel, and that's going to suck, because the barrels are expensive. The reason I got the complete firearm and didn't buy a barrel is because they were the same price. And so I figured to myself, hey, if I can get a completely new gun and then trade out the barrels and see if that's the issue, if I can diagnose it that way, hey, I got a new pistol, so hey. But although this barrel did not work flush because of the tolerances, that's what I think it is. I could take a grinder to this and grind it down. I'm not going to do that. And I'm not going to do that now, because it works in this other pistol just fine. It does not work on that slide. It was causing all kinds of issues. I don't know why. I think it's the tolerances. All I know is that when I switched them out, my headache and my heartburn completely went away. And now with this one, it doesn't do that either. The cool thing about this is it sits flush. It sits really flush on the top. It did that with this as well, but it was catching. It's catching on something. It does not catch on this one. Also, this OEM barrel does not sit flush. It is completely in battery. It is completely in battery. I've taken the slide off and looked at it, and everything that is supposed to be where it's supposed to be is where it's supposed to be. It just doesn't sit flush on this, and I think it's because this slide is just built differently. It just has different tolerances and different measurements and cuts. And so this OEM barrel it's nice and it works. It works in this. Consequently enough, when I put the barrel in here too, it doesn't sit very flush. And so it's supposed to be like that. So if you're running into those types of issues as far as it not going back in the battery, that may be the issue there. It's most likely going to be your barrel and your slide, unless you got a P80 lower and you really cut that thing up, or if there's still, you know, chunks of plastic in there or something, then your tolerances are going to be different as well. But hear me out with this, it's more than likely your barrel, especially if it's a match grade barrel, because those are meant to be, they're meant to have material taken off of them, which I'm not going to do. Okay, the last thing. So nose down or nose up malfunctions, it's your magazine. It's gonna be your magazine. I was using this Pro Mag. They suck as far as this one is concerned. This one sucks. I don't want to say that Pro Mag produces bad magazines or anything like that. Hear me out, I'm not saying that. This one sucks. You'll see here, it doesn't have an anti-tilt follower. And so this will actually go down further. It'll do a tilt like this. If the round is pushed down, it will allow the round to go down. And so you'll get those malfunctions. You'll get the round down malfunction. And so it'll nosedive into your barrel, or it'll nosedive into the chamber and get stuck, and it'll do things that you don't want it to do, because it doesn't have the anti-tilt. It tilts. It will tilt this way and it will tilt up, and you don't want that to happen. And with these longer non-OEM magazines, you're going to have those types of issues. But with this one specifically, yeah, no good. Not going to use that. One malfunction is too many. These ETS magazines, these are not OEM, but you'll see here that when this part goes down, the rest of it goes down. It has an anti-tilt follower here, and so it'll do that all the way up. I haven't had an issue with these as far as that malfunction is concerned. Same with this one, and these are both ETS. Now these are both factory magazines. This shorter one, and that'll go with this. This here, it has the 22 length barrel, but the shorter grip, which I think is great. I have this OEM Gen 5 magazine for this Gen 3 internal, Gen 5 structured firearm. And so this seems to work just fine. This one works great. As long as all of the other issues were taken care of, this will no longer jam into the barrel at a way that I don't want it to. And consequently, and thankfully, this longer magazine that fits inside of a Glock 22 fits nice and flush. See that? Well, there's a little knob at the bottom there, but you know what I mean. It also fits in this one. Now, this is not flush. It doesn't have that little knob. It has a big kind of, you know, inch long, not a gap, but it protrudes out of the bottom there. That doesn't seem to matter. That doesn't mess with anything, because again, even the OEM have an anti-tilt follower in the magazines. And so if yours is nosediving in one way or another, the magazine is the issue, unless there's something else going on there, but this is causing it. All right, so give that a try. I hope this helped in some way, and I would start with the least expensive thing first. And if you're tired of the trigger slop at the end of your trigger pull, get that Ghost connector. If you don't want a lot of take up on your trigger pull, get the Timney trigger. If you don't want your rounds to nosedive into your barrel, get OEM magazines. If you don't want your slide to get hung up on your barrel, get an OEM barrel and try that. All right, do what's right and stay safe. Also, please consider subscribing. It would really help the channel out a lot. I'd be able to make more of these videos as far as in-depth diagnosis of problems that you're going to run into so that we can help each other make firearms more safe.